Okay, so overall, as a group, y'all actually did pretty well on the first quiz. I was pretty well impressed by how well you were keeping track of the details. In general, I feel like if most of the class is getting a 75 or better, then we're doing pretty well. One thing that everybody missed, though, the thing that keeps the soldier away from the village. He's afraid of the barking dog. So just remember as you're reading to keep an eye out for those kinds of details, right? And again, remember too, like, I'm going to drop the lowest 3, and each of these are worth 1 point out of 100, right? So if you don't do so hot on a couple of them, it's not the end of the world. What the hell is this? Where did it come from? Mildly terrifying. Okay. So that said, for next time, we're going to be completing another vocabulary quiz over the weekend. So that will open up on Friday morning. You'll have till Sunday midnight to finish it. And you're going to be reading the excerpts from Olaudah Equiano's autobiography for Monday. So let me just show you what I've got for you on that on Georgia View, and then we'll start into today's material. The damn remote. Okay. So if you go to Georgia View and you click on the Content tab, as we see this, I'm just going to wait for this to appear. If you click on the Black Autobiography in Georgian Britain tab, this is what you'll see. There's a BBC documentary on Equiano's life. There is a BBC radio podcast also about Equiano. There's a History Channel special detailing what life was like aboard a slave ship. And there's also a quick drunk history account of the careers of a group called the Sons of Africa, to which Equiano belonged. And the drunk history, like, it's funny, it's a Comedy Channel thing, but it is actually mostly accurate. So, all right. So, to start into today's stuff, if nobody has any questions about anything, does anybody have any questions? Okay, great. So I want to kind of pick up where we left off last time with monuments. So this is a statue in the port city of Bristol. Of a prominent Bristolian by the name of Edward Colston. So Colston was born in 1636. Died in 1721, and was a prominent local merchant, philanthropist, and Tory politician. There are a lot of buildings and public amenities named for Colston in Bristol. He funded a lot of these public works projects during his career. However, Colston made most of his fortune as a director and investor in a group called the Royal African Company. Which was chartered in 1660 and lasted in some form until 1821. And I'll give you 3 guesses what the Royal African Company primarily traded. And the first 2 don't count.
Slaves.
Yes, they were predominantly a slave trading company. Now, they also traded in African goods like ivory and spices, but their primary business was slave trading. So during the summer of protests in 2020, Colston's statue found itself in a new location at the bottom of Bristol Harbor. I particularly appreciate the way Google Maps lists the attraction as closed. Right? You can't get there. So the toppling of Colston's statue was part of a kind of broader public reckoning with monuments to 18th and 19th century Britons who had made their fortunes and their reputations either through slave trading or through aggressive promotion of colonialism, right? So I wanted to use this as an introduction to our discussion today about the debate over slavery in Britain, to show that the legacy of this is still a live issue, right? That this is still something that is a hot button topic in contemporary British discourse and contemporary politics, right? Much as there's a live issue here about the history of Confederate, about what to do about Confederate monuments and things of that nature, right? They're having the same kinds of conversations in Britain. So, what do y'all know about the transatlantic trade triangle? How familiar are you guys with this concept? This is something many of you have gone over in history classes, or okay, so it's not totally new. Okay, great. So what was the trade triangle? How did it work?
It went from, didn't it go from Africa to Europe to the Americas?
Those are the three, kind of like the three, what do you call the ends of the triangle? Now my geometry is failing me. Those are the 3 points in the triangle, right? Yeah, we start, at least for our purposes, right, England. We sail to West Africa. From West Africa to the Americas, especially the West Indies, and from the West Indies back to England. So from England, you're primarily bringing manufactured goods. To trade in West Africa. And they would trade those manufactured goods for, as we noted, slaves, ivory, and spices. They'd then come to the West Indies and trade that for rum and sugar, take that back to England, and continue the cycle anew, right? Now, what gets the most attention from scholars today is this route from West Africa to the Americas, what was called the Middle Passage. In which large numbers of slaves were kept below decks, chained up, unable to move, for periods of 1 to 6 months, right, depending on the weather and how fast your ship was. Right? It took at least a month to get from West Africa to the Americas. If the weather was bad, it could take up to 6. So you could have people who were kind of trapped there below decks for half a year before they could get off. It is estimated that 15% of captured Africans died at sea. And that's not counting those who were killed in the attempt to seize or capture them, or those who died when they got to the Americas. So, this is all at the end of the 18th century, throughout the British sphere of influence, perfectly legal. And most people don't really think too much about it, in part because of the European appetite for sugar. Prior to the 18th century, most Europeans didn't eat a lot of sugar. You could grow sugar beets in Europe, but the sugar that a beet produces is lousy compared to what you can get from sugar cane. You can get more sugar and better quality sugar from cane than you can from a beet, but sugar cane doesn't grow in Europe, right? The climate isn't right for it. Not to mention that it's a difficult and dangerous crop to plant and harvest. So this is labor that was then largely turned over to slaves. And every time, I think, and this is one of the things that Coleridge wants to remind us of, particularly in his speech, is that every time you even see a character in a poem or a play or a novel sweetening their tea, or spreading jam on toast or something like that, they're participating, whether they realize it or not, in this trade. Right? This is all fueled by this appetite for sugar. So, have you guys taken U.S. History 1? Okay, so who did you take it with? With Kutzler? Okay, so you probably went over with him the typical pro-slavery arguments, right? Do you remember what they tended to be? No? Okay. All right. So the British pro-slavery arguments, on the whole, were not much different from the same ones that one heard from plantation owners in the United States, right? One was that slave owning was sanctioned by Scripture, right? That various biblical figures owned slaves, and no one says anything critical about that. So, God must think this is okay. Right? In fact, this is one of the arguments that William Cobbett uses. This is the opening argument William Cobbett uses, right, in the excerpt we have here. If you look on page 118, that the sacred scriptures of the Old and New Testament authorize the slave trade, your lordship dares not deny. Nay, my lord, you must allow that they do more. Under the law, the slave trade is in a manner commanded by God Almighty, and under the gospel dispensation, the holding in slavery persons purchased as slaves is not only mentioned by our blessed Savior and his apostles without censure or disapprobation, but rules are given by St. Paul and 1 Peter how slaves ought to demean themselves to their masters. If the purchasing slaves be now inhuman and unjust, it must always have been so. And the keeping persons in slavery so unjustly acquired must have been equally so. And your lordship must either allow the purchase and possession of slaves to be consistent with the law of God, unless you can show when that law was abrogated, or acknowledge the patriarchs, prophets, apostles, martyrs, saints, confessors, fathers, and bishops of the Church of God, both under the law and the gospel, who have purchased, sold, or possessed slaves, bondmen and bondmaids, have acted with cruelty, oppression, inhumanity, and injustice. Such an opinion would be directly contrary to those doctrines which your lordship teaches, and which you and Mr. Wilberforce profess to believe. More on Mr. Wilberforce in a moment. Right? Wilberforce is actually an important guy here. But what's Cobbett's basic argument here?
The sense that it was okay back then, it should be okay now.
Yeah. What's changed to suddenly make it not okay, right? Can you show me, he says, where that law was ever abrogated, right? If God didn't mind it then, he doesn't mind it now. So yeah, so Cobbett's argument is a version of this, right? And is also animated in part by his, there are economic issues as well that are part animated by his dislike of William Wilberforce. But again, we'll get to that in a minute. Another common argument was that slavery under British masters was less brutal than life under African lords. However, this is belied by the fact that, by and large, in order to capture slaves, slave traders incited African chieftains to fight amongst themselves and capture slaves to sell to them, right? So a lot of the warfare that was going on in West Africa at the time, and a lot of the slave taking that was going on in West Africa at the time, was directly instigated by Europeans. And one of the third common arguments was that the evils of slavery, which people making this argument acknowledged, are compensated for by the salvation of slaves who are converted to Christianity. So, this raises a couple of questions, right? Like, one, couldn't you simply convert people through persuasion without having to enslave them? And secondly, are people converting because they want to convert or because they are being forced to convert? And even a lot of the abolitionist arguments at the time seem to regard Africans as somehow inherently childlike or inferior, right? As people who need protection from Europeans. And I think we see a little bit of that paternalistic attitude maybe in Clarkson, maybe a little bit less so in Coleridge. But what I want to try to do here is kind of create the context in which these arguments are taking place for you, right? So let's talk a little bit about Thomas Clarkson. Let's go to his short essay here. What did y'all think of this? Was there anything about Clarkson's piece that particularly struck you?
When he was talking about the slaves and like where they kept them and how they treated them, that was just whack.
Okay, you took it like when he's talking about the Zong incident? Yeah. So he starts by talking about the typical, he's comparing two slave ships to each other, right? That he thinks of as more or less typical, right? So let's start there. Right, on page 100, right? As much has been said by the advocates for this trade of the accommodation which slaves experience during the Middle Passage, I shall say a few words on that head. The height of their apartments varies, of course, according to the size of the vessel, but may be stated to be from 6 feet to less than 3, so that it is impossible for them to stand erect in most of the vessels that transport them, and in some scarcely to sit down in the same posture. In cases of this kind, it is better to be explicit and to mention particular facts. I shall therefore give the reader the dimensions of 2 vessels that sailed about 6 months ago from a British port to the coast of Africa for slaves. I do not mean as tenders to other ships, but to collect them on their own account and to carry them to the colonies. And then he goes on to describe these 2 ships, right? One of which was designed as a pleasure ship for about 6 people to go boating about on rivers, right? And now, they're cramming, more than 30 slaves down below decks, right? But what do we know here specifically so far about the conditions he describes on these ships? What can't people who are down below in the cargo hold do?
Stand up.
Yeah, they can't stand and they can't comfortably sit, right? So they're kind of forced into an uncomfortable crouch. Again, remember, for a period of what could be up to 6 months. Now, if we look on page 101, he begins to imaginatively construct for us what happens to people in these conditions, right? And one thing we should note about Clarkson is a lot of his constructions here are imaginary extrapolation from data, right? So it's like, so he's got this data that he's gathered about slave ships, and now he's kind of gathering he's imagining what it must be like based on this set of facts, right? Imagine only for a moment the gratings to be open, but particularly after a rain, which has occasioned them to be covered for some time. The first thing that presents itself is a cluster of unhappy people who, overcome by excessive heat and stench, have faded away. The next that occurs is that one of them, endeavoring to press forward the light to catch a mouthful of wholesome air, but hindered by the partner of his chains who is lying dead at his feet, and whom he has not sufficient strength to drag after him. The third is conspicuous in the instance of those who are just on the point of fainting, and who are wallowing in the blood and mucus of the intestines with which the floor is covered. Such are the scenes that universally present themselves in the case supposed, and how agonizing and insufferable their situation must have been during this period of their confinement, none, I believe, can possibly conceive unless they had been the partners of their chains. So, what's this scene look like? What's the picture Clarkson's trying to paint for us here?
Like they're sitting with dead people in like bathroom all over the floor.
Yeah, living people are chained to corpses. Everybody's like stuck in their own filth, right? Nobody can move. Nobody can get to the light or get a mouthful of fresh air, right? And then what do we make of this last sentence, right? How agonizing and insufferable their situation must have been during this period of their confinement, none, I believe, can possibly conceive unless they had been the partners of their chains. Now think back to some of these 18th century literary techniques we've been talking about. Can you figure out what Clarkson is doing here, what he's trying to evoke in the reader? Particularly think about that last bit there, unless they had been the partners of their chains.
Is he trying to like make the people reading it like feel, not necessarily pity, but like feel a sense of what they're going through and realizing that it's not humane?
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what's going on here, right? So let's, do we remember when we talked about, say, like Adam Smith and David Hume, how those philosophers believed we developed our moral sense? Where did did Smith and Hume think our morals came from? Okay, so they arise, right, from sympathy, from our ability to imagine ourselves in the position of others, right? Now, the problem with sympathy as an ethical mode is that it is always, in some sense, self-centered, right? Like, can I ever actually know what you're feeling? No, because I'm not you. Right? Like, yeah, I can't actually inhabit your mind or your senses. So, there's an interesting passage in Smith's book in which he, kind of questions, like, why do we pity dead people? Why do we pity dead people? Their problems are over, right? But we imagine what it would be like for ourselves to be in a box underground, right? To be shut off from light, to be cut off from our loved ones. And so our feelings have everything to do with ourselves and our own imagined sense impressions, and not really anything to do with the person with whom we're sympathizing. I think when we get to Coleridge, we'll see some sense of that, right? But the basic idea is that you cultivate sympathy through sensibility. Now, do we remember what sensibility was? Thinking along the right lines there, yeah?
Perception to sense impression.
Yes, sensibility is your receptivity to sense impressions. And people of great sensibility, right, people who cultivate their sensibility, will also, according to the logic of this moral theory, grow in benevolence, right? Right, if you are better able to imagine the sufferings of others in sensory detail, then this will make you kinder and more generous, right? So that's the basic strategy, I think, that Clarkson is using here. And it's a pretty common one for the period. But he does also use a lot of hard facts here as well, and reference to genuine incidents in order to back this up, right? So this isn't all imaginary constructions of what life is like on a slave ship, right? To back this up, he gives us this account of what happened on a ship called the Zong in, 1783? 1781. So what happened on the Zong?
The captain threw them overboard because they were sick.
Yeah. The captain threw all of the slaves on the ship overboard. Now, what's the reason he claims he did it? So there was there was sickness on the ship, right? It was spreading. And it's his fear for the health and well-being of the people below decks. Why is sickness spreading among the slaves a problem?
Because they were all like next to each other, like they're changing climates.
Yeah, and that's probably a lot of what caused it, is the bad conditions on the ship and and being unused to the climate and that sort of thing, right? But from the captain's perspective, what's the basic problem here if the slaves keep getting sick? Is he thinking of these slaves as human beings? Yeah, they're cargo to him, right? They're things.
If they get sick, he doesn't get paid.
Yes, exactly. If they get sick, if there aren't enough of them to sell to make it profitable, he's on the hook for it. So, in order to prevent himself from having to take a big financial loss, he has them all thrown overboard and claims there wasn't enough water on the ship, right? Which a court determines is a lie. And that he was basically convicted of insurance fraud, right? So that's the thing that's, I think, hardest to grasp from an early 21st century perspective here, right? As in 1781, this captain could kill all of these people, have all of these people thrown overboard, and be convicted not of murder, but of insurance fraud. Right? The crime was against his insurance company, not against the people he threw overboard. And again, I think we have to consider this in terms of who was actually considered to be a fully fledged human being and who wasn't. So there's a French anthropologist I like to bring up when we talk about this. His name is Claude Massot. I am not sure I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, but that's how you spell it. And Massot's work is primarily on slavery. And he draws a distinction between what he calls the condition of slavery and the state of slavery. And yeah, take note of this because this is going to come back up with Equiano. So the condition of slavery refers to the material conditions under which a slave lives, right? Are they treated more or less humanely, right? Are they beaten or not? Are they fed enough? Are they given shelter, right? The state of slavery is the legal status of a slave as property or as an object. And one of the things that Massot argues is that we tend to get overly hung up on the first part of this and not hung up enough on the second part of this, right? That we worry too much about the conditions under which a slave is kept and not enough about the simple fact that one person can be another person's property, right? So for Massot, arguments about condition are largely distractions that are kind of taking away from the bigger issue about whether or not one can own other people or not. And Clarkson clearly seems to think not, right? So there's one other thing in Clarkson that I want to focus on here. What did you make of his the conversation he constructs here between himself and the imaginary African? What happens here?
Well, he talks to the African like almost as a visitor, like not really knowing what's going on. And the African tells him like, oh, they took our people, you can hear them screaming.
Yeah.
And African gives him like really what happened. Whereas he's getting like the British version of what happened.
Sure, yeah, well, yeah. What does Clarkson actually see the train of slaves as? What does it look like to him? Like, what does he see? Yeah, he sees a cloud of dust approaching, right? And so let's just think about that image for a minute, right? What does it mean that he sees this as a cloud of dust rather than as, he sees a cloud of dust from a distance rather than a group of people chained together marching in line, right? What does the cloud of dust suggest?
Where they were living? I don't know.
Well, think about it, like, if you, like, do you ever have like a pet, like go in the backyard and kick up a lot of dirt and kick up a lot of dust, right? And at least for a little while they're doing it, it's a little bit hard to see them, right, if they're kicking up a lot of it. So the idea of the cloud of dust here, right, is that Clarkson, like, the dust obscures what Clarkson's actually looking at, right? The whole point is that he can't see this clearly. So the cloud of dust is kind of on one level kind of like a metaphor for his ignorance of what's going on. That then has to be explained to him by an African with whom he then has this conversation about Christianity and heathenism, right? And remember that, a lot of the arguments that people made in favor of slavery were based on some interpretation of Scripture and of Christian principles, right? So let's look at the arguments that they have here, the Christian versus heathen debate here. Well, let's think about the word heathen first for a second, right? Like, if we refer to someone as a heathen, do we usually mean anything nice or complimentary by it? Yeah, it's usually kind of like a way of saying, like, describing somebody's beliefs as barbaric, right? We think your beliefs are barbaric or primitive. Heathenism is uncivilized belief. Can I get one of you to read for us, starting at the bottom of page 99, the paragraph that starts with, "And now as I have mentioned the name of Christians."
And now as I mention the name of Christians, a name by which the Europeans distinguish themselves from us, I could wish to be informed of the meaning which such an appellation may convey. They consider themselves as men, but us unfortunate Africans, who they term heathens, as the beasts that serve us. But how different is the fact? What is Christianity but a system of murder and oppression? The cries and yells of the unfortunate people, who are now soon to embark for the regions of servitude, have already pierced my heart. Have you not heard me sigh while we have been talking? Do you not see the tears that now trickle down my cheeks? And yet these hardened Christians are unable to be moved at all. Nay, they will scourge them amidst their groans, and even smile while they are torturing them to death. Happy heathenism, which can detest the vices of Christianity and fulfill the distresses of mankind.
Right, and then Jordan, can you read the next paragraph for us?
But our God, you are totally mistaken. Christianity is the most perfect and loving of moral system. It blesses even the hand of perception itself and returns good for evil. But the people against whom you so justly declare are not Christians. They are infidels. They are monsters. They are out of the common course of nature. Their countrymen at home are generous and brave. They support the sick, the lame, and the blind. They fly to the succor
Sucker, yep.
distress. They have noble and stately buildings for the sole purpose of benevolence.
Mhm.
They are short of all nations the most remarkable for humanity and justice.
Okay, so pause for a second here, right? What does Christianity mean to each of these two figures here? What does Christianity mean to the African?
Murder and oppression.
Yeah, it's just straight up like murder and oppression, right? Because that's the only experience he has of Europeans who call themselves Christians, right? And then what is Clarkson's response to this?
Christianity is the most perfect and loving of the world systems.
Yeah. And then, what kinds of examples then does he give to back this up?
That they help the sick and the blind and everyone in trouble.
Yeah. That, the whole point of Christianity is to help the afflicted, right? To provide, to provide for the weak and the poor and the helpless and all that, right? And then the African responds, right? But why then, replies the honest African, do they suffer this? Why is Africa a scene of blood and desolation? Why are her children wrested from her to administer to the luxuries and greatness of those whom they never offended? And why are these dismal cries in vain? So what is he suggesting here about all of these kindly, supportive European Christians that Clarkson has just been talking about?
He's suggesting if they do so good for all the people in Europe and all that, why are they being so cruel and nasty to the people in Africa?
Yeah, if they're so good, why do they let this happen, right? And Clarkson then kind of lamely responds, well, they can't hear you from here, right? Too many people just don't know what's going on. And then the last sentence of this, but here a shriek unusually loud, accompanied with a dreadful rattling of chains, interrupted the discourse. So just as he's trying to explain why people in England don't do anything about this, right? It's because we just don't know. There's this dreadfully loud rattling of chains, right? What is he really trying to indicate there about the excuse he himself is trying to make?
It is an excuse. You can say all you want, but there it's right in front of your face.
Yeah. If you can't hear the rattling, right, it's because you're not listening. If you can't hear it, it's because you just don't want to hear it and you're tuning it out. And I think that this is pretty similar to the argument that Coleridge is making when he's trying to get this group that he's speaking to in Bristol to boycott sugar, right? Now, I think but they are actually at some level employing different strategies here, right? So Clarkson is gathering facts and data to try to make political change. Clarkson is a member of a group called the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. So this is a group that's founded in 1787. Right, 2 years before the French Revolution. And whose membership is made up mostly of dissenters. Do you guys remember what a dissenter is in religious terms in Britain? This is something we talked about in the first week, so it may not have stuck. So a dissenter is a non-Anglican Protestant. Right? So people who are Protestants but are not members of the Church of England. So, so like Quakers, Unitarians, Methodists, Baptists, and so on, Presbyterians, so on and so forth. And do you remember anything about the political status of people who were not Anglicans in late 18th century Britain?
They have them.
Yeah, they couldn't serve in Parliament, right? Because they refused to take the oath that said that the king was head of both church and state. So this hampered some of their political organizing strategies, right? The fact that because they couldn't serve in Parliament, their own influence was limited. So they got people like Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce who were kind of liberal-minded Anglicans to press their case in Parliament. Right? Clarkson was never elected to Parliament, but Wilberforce was, and tried to advance several bills for the abolition of slavery before one finally succeeded in the early 1830s. More on that when we talk about it next time. But another member of this group was a lawyer by the name of Granville Sharp. And the piece of music that I was playing at the beginning of class, that late 18th century slave chant from Barbados, that was found a few years ago in Sharp's papers by a musicologist who was then able to reconstruct what it was supposed to sound like. But yeah, these guys were looking primarily for a political solution. So they were like a lobbying group trying to get Parliament to enact legislation. Coleridge's strategy is different. What does Coleridge think needs to be done in order to break the back of the slave trade?
Boycott sugar.
Yeah, boycott sugar and rum, right? Sugar specifically, but he also mentions rum. And why does he think of sugar and rum as particularly suited for this kind of boycott?
Because they're more harsh for production.
Okay, yeah, in fact, rum is actually produced from sugar too, right? Rum is distilled from molasses, which is a byproduct of sugar. So yes, these are both kind of made from the same cane farming process, right? And does anybody actually need either of these things? He's also partly making a moral argument here, right? That the things that are being extracted through slave labor in the West Indies are useless luxuries. And yeah, does sugar make some of your food taste a little better? Yeah. But would you die if it was taken away? He says on page 116, right? If only 1/10 part among you who profess yourself Christians, if 1/2 only of the petitioners instead of bustling about with ostentatious sensibility, were to leave off not all the West India commodities, but only sugar and rum, the one useless and the other pernicious, all this misery might be stopped. Right. So one is useless and the other is actively bad for you. So he's saying if you just gave up these two things. Now, part of where this is coming from is Coleridge's idealism as a young poet and activist, right? So what he's trying to do in this speech is actually part of a series of speeches that he gave. You may remember Robert Southey from last time, who wrote The Victory. So these two young poets were friends in the 1790s, and they had a plan to buy acres and acres of land in Pennsylvania and start a utopian colony there where all people would be equal, that they called pantisocracy. Right? Meaning something like rule by all, or rule by everyone. So they had this idea for this kind of like anarchist commune, right? Where people could just kind of go and live simple, beautiful lives. This never got off the ground for a variety of reasons. But one of the things that Coleridge and Southey did to try to raise money for the venture was give lectures to which they charged admission. So the audience that he is shouting at here to boycott sugar is also a paying audience. Right? These are people who have given him money to hear him harangue them. But the last thing I want to look at here, and then we'll kind of maybe let the rest of this go for next time, is the last paragraph of Coleridge's excerpt. Can I get one of you to lead for us? Starting with, there is observable among the many a false and bastard sensibility.
There is observable among the many a false and bastard sensibility that prompts them to remove those evils and those evils alone, which by hideous spectacle or clamorous outcry are present to their senses and disturb their selfish enjoyments. Other miseries, though equally certain and far more horrible, they not only do not endeavor to remedy, they support and fatten on them. Provided on the dunghill be not before their parlor window, they are well content to know that it exists, and that it is the hotbed of their pestilent luxuries. To this grievous failing we must attribute the frequency of wars and the continuance of the slave trade. The merchant finds no argument against it in his ledger. The citizen at the crowded feast is not nauseated by the stench and filth of the slave vessel. The fine lady's nerves are not shattered by the shrieks. She sips a beverage sweetened with human blood, even while she is weeping over the refined sorrows of Werder or of Clementino. Sensibility is not benevolence. Nay, by making us tremblingly alive to trifling misfortunes, it as frequently prevents it, and induces effeminate and cowardly selfishness. Our own sorrows, like the princes of hell in Milton's Pandemonium, sit enthroned, bulky and vast, while the miseries of our fellow creatures dwindle into pygmy forms and are crowded in innumerable multitude into some dark corner of the heart. There is one criterion by which we may always distinguish benevolence from mere sensibility. Benevolence entails to action and is accompanied by self-denial.
Okay, thank you. So, how is Coleridge taking a different approach here to moral development, say, than Clarkson is?
He puts more guilt on the consumers.
Okay, yeah. In fact, he even uses the word consumed at one point in regards to slaves, right? So yeah, he is kind of putting more guilt on the consumers, right? But what does Clarkson seem to hope will make people see his point or bring people around? What is he trying to cultivate in his readers? that Coleridge kind of calls out right away at the beginning of this paragraph.
Christianity?
It's not, Coleridge actually doesn't have a problem with Christianity. He's a pretty, wacky out there Christian at this stage in his career, but he eventually kind of hardens into a fairly conventional conservative Anglican. It's not really, let's just look at the first sentence on the top, at the top of the paragraph. Do we see a familiar word here that has popped up today and in past classes? Sensibility, yes. So what Coleridge here is arguing against is the notion that sensibility actually makes you benevolent, right? That, he's seeing that, people here in his audience who can cry over the sorrows of a character in a novel, right? Okay, the fact that you can cry over the sorrows of a fictional character, if that doesn't impel you to act to help your fellow human beings, right? Then what good does that do? So he's suggesting here that there is no connection between sensibility and morality, right? Or more specifically, between sensibility and benevolence, right? That if those sorrows you feel do not compel you to act, then they're just shadows. There's nothing to them. They don't serve any purpose. So, Coleridge doesn't invent any imaginary situations here. He doesn't kind of extrapolate visions from a set of data, right? He's focusing on a specific action that he wants people to take for a particular moral aim, right? So this is kind of representing an almost kind of more direct strategy than what Clarkson is arguing for. And when we read Ola Luda Equiano next time, Equiano is actually pretty closely aligned with Clarkson's group and is mentored by several people within this group. So this is all a lot of this is going to come back up when we look at his autobiography next time. So does anybody have any questions about anything? All right, I'm going to give you the guide questions for Equiano, and we'll let you go.